I just want to tell you how important I think you all are, every last one of you. I will tell you that, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about this, but I've done my time over the years in county election boards, so I know what that's like. And everything about our elections happens at that local election board. And so I just can't tell you how much it means to me and to people who don't even know how much you, every one of you, how much you matter, how much the fact that you care about this enough to tune in on a Tuesday night and to go to these meetings and to do all these things, you have no idea how much that matters. And so I want to talk a little bit about that, about how what we're doing, what's happening nationwide. But the one thing I will tell you is that I go everywhere and I tell people, you have to do what they're doing in Fairfax County, Virginia. The building of this local task force that's looking at everything in the election process, soup to nuts. That's what I just keep pointing to you guys and saying, you've got to have those volunteers and you've got to direct them and you've got to guide them. And this, you got to do what they're doing in Fairfax. So I want to talk about that as we go through our discussion. Christine, you're very gracious to describe me, and I really appreciate that. I appreciate the compliments. I have been doing election-related work for decades. My very first assignment when I was in law school at the University of Oklahoma, I was on the absentee ballot board. And that meant that I was they always had a Democrat and a Republican, and we would take these old wooden ballot boxes to nursing homes. And you had the Democrat and the Republican, so they were watching each other and make sure that those in the nursing homes had the right to vote, but that nobody manipulated their vote. So I wanted to make sure that we had a section of every task force and of the Citizens Guide about protecting vulnerable voters, because I've done that. I've seen how it's supposed to work, and we saw in 2020 how it didn't work. So just let me give you a little bit of an overview of kind of what's happening around the country. I started let me back up. Christine mentioned to you that I was a volunteer attorney for President Trump in Georgia after the 2020 election. I was actually in Montana for the election. I was working on their election day operations. I represented Senator Daines. I was in private law practice. I represented the Republican Party of Montana, and I've been working with them all through 2020. The left filed, Mark Elias and that whole crowd, they filed 4 separate lawsuits against to invalidate various Montana election laws. And of course, the corruption of the courts in Montana. Well, let me tell you, we could have a whole session one night about the corruption of the courts in America, because I think that that is truly one of the great travesties that we saw in 2020, where we saw judges across the country rewrite election laws that had been duly enacted by the legislatures. And then we saw the complete abdication of judicial responsibility in the post-election by not upholding the laws and ensuring that the elections that had been conducted in violation of those laws, that somehow there was some accountability, and they completely abdicated their responsibility. But I was asked by President Trump's chief of staff, Mark Meadows, the day after the election. I was in Bozeman, and he called me and asked if I would go to Atlanta. And so I went to Atlanta, and I began to work on just looking at what had happened. And what became clear to me and our little band of volunteer attorneys was that the election had been conducted in violation of many of the Georgia statutes. And we ended up putting together and filing a 64-page election contest in which we identified over 30 categories of illegal votes that had been cast and counted and were included in the certified total. And there were many more illegal votes than the margin of difference between President Trump and Joe Biden. But we had over 1,000 pages of affidavits from fact witnesses and expert witnesses and all. And the fact is, we never had a judge appointed to hear the case. So when people say President Trump lost every lawsuit. Well, he didn't lose our lawsuit because we never had a judge appointed to hear it. Well, I guess we had a judge appointed the day before the electors were going to be certified. So that's what I spent the day of January 6th doing, was working on that, and then ending up having to dismiss the case after the Georgia electors were certified, because at that point it was moot. But because of my involvement with the president, of course, some of the never Trump crazy people like that, those perverts with the Lincoln Project, they came after me. I ended up resigning my 20-year partnership with my big law firm. And when God closes a door, he opens a window. And now I am, as Christine said, I'm with the Conservative Partnership Institute, which was founded by former Senator Jim DeMint, and is where Mark Meadows is as well. And I joined 1 year ago this week as the senior legal fellow, and put together over the last year, been working on putting together the Election Integrity Network. And my focus and our focus is to strengthen and provide capabilities and resources and tools to conservatives across this country, to patriotic citizens, patriots, people who are concerned about the election of 2020 and who want to do something to make sure that doesn't happen again. And so we started this website, Who's Counting, www.whoscounting.us. And as Christine said, I have a podcast. Actually, interestingly, I don't know if I've ever told Christine this, but I've gotten more comments about the interviews that I did with Christine and with Shelley Overlander from Loudoun County, and with Ned Jones, who was a citizen researcher and involved with the Virginia Project in 2021. And because I wanted people to know what they can do. And that's really the important thing here. What can we do? And I know that there have been a lot of people, tens of thousands of people since the 2020 election doing a lot of different things. But to me, what we need to do is to fight against the left and the Democrats and their efforts to federalize the elections, which we have been fighting them all year, all of last year. We have been fighting to keep them from codifying into federal law all the mischief from 2020. They have had proposals that have sailed through the Democratic House and only have been stopped because of Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema's refusal to allow these horrible bills to become law with a simple majority. They have stood fast on the filibuster, even though both Sinema and Manchin have co-authored these bad bills. So they're for the bills, but they believe that the Senate filibuster should be respected. And if it were not for the filibuster, we would really be in a very terrible situation. And I'll tell you before we go tonight about the terrible situation I think we're facing. But so in the last year, we've been trying to give resources and tools and information through the website, through the podcast. And believe me, we're doing this in the face of the fact that, well, I think some of you shared some of this earlier today, that the Department of Homeland Security, just like Merrick Garland defined parents who attend school board meetings as domestic terrorists, that the domestic terrorist threat by the Department of Homeland Security has been elevated because of us, because we don't believe the narrative, their false narrative that everything in 2020 was just fine with the election. Well, we know that's not true. It isn't true. The facts over the last year as they've emerged have proven that to be the case. We now have official reports from Arizona and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Georgia that document that there are more illegal votes in the final margin, in the final certified totals, than the margin of difference between the presidential candidates. But we know, here's one thing we know, that when we are at the election offices and when we are encouraging people to fulfill their statutory duties to be election officials, to be poll watchers, to do all those things that the law envisions a role for the citizens to have oversight over their elections. That is the law in every state. And as we step forward and pick up that mantle and say, we haven't done this like we should have, and now we're going to do it. Well, guess what? They don't like that. That's what they call acts of terrorism. I should share with you, I told Christine, I'm working on a whole PowerPoint. I'll come back and do this. But last week, a left-wing organization called Third Way issued this PowerPoint that essentially, it's entitled How Republicans Plan to Steal the 2024 Election. And one of the ways they say that we're going to steal the election is that we're going to put in big lie vote counters. Big lie vote counters. That means when we say, like in the name of my podcast, Who's Counting, the name of our website, Who's Counting, that when we're there watching how the ballots are being counted and how the election is being conducted, that somehow, because we believe that that ensures integrity, that's part of the massive plan to steal the presidential election 2024. And the other thing that they talk about are the massive vote suppressors, and what they call vote suppression are those of us who believe that the elections ought to be conducted in accordance with the law. And I could give you a lot of examples, but the point is they don't like it that we are talking about and doing the work of being in the election system, because the left has had that to themselves for more than a decade. They have spent hundreds of millions of dollars creating entities to a basic infrastructure that supports this massive mail voting. And they have been engaged in the election process and the election system with the Election Assistance Commission. They've, that Committee for Tech and Civic Life. Tech and Civic Life. That's the group that Zuckerbucks gave. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg and his wife Priscilla Chan gave 360. $50-70 million. They gave another 65 million to a separate 501c3. But that CTCL, it is listed on the EAC website as a partner to help train election officials and election workers on how to use technology. They have been doing this and building this network that's interwoven in the election offices. So I tell you all that because if they weren't afraid of our being involved and engaged in the way that you are involved and engaged, they wouldn't be attacking us. They wouldn't be issuing those Homeland Security terrorism alerts. They wouldn't be calling us vote suppressionists and big lie vote counters. They're calling us names. They want to intimidate us. Don't forget that Merrick Garland, about 6 weeks before he issued his letter calling parents domestic terrorists before going to school board meetings, 6 weeks before that, he had issued a statement, an announcement that they were setting up an election official hotline at the FBI so that the FBI could, that election officials who felt, quote, threatened, harassed, or intimidated could call this FBI hotline and report on people like you and me for being in the election offices. So it is a very big threat that they're trying to intimidate us, but that just shows that the place they don't want us is the election office. And so I'm going to go through just a few key points about, Christine mentioned the Citizens Guide to Election Integrity. I tried to think of the things that the waterfront of things that need to happen with a citizens group and the types of efforts that need to be made to really be a full-blown watchdog over the election offices in every county in America. And I'm a very big believer that if we learn these things, if we're there, and I've been having this argument, not really an argument, but certainly with a discussion with the RNC, because the RNC is very focused on recruiting election workers and poll watchers, and then the war room once voting starts. And we know that's crucial. Many of you played that role. I think you actually saved the election in Virginia in 2021. But I keep telling them, you can't wait till voting starts. You have to be in these, we have to have our people in the election offices 365 days a year. We have to be watching, monitoring what they're doing. And you guys are doing that, which is just remarkable to me. So I do hold you up as the ideal for the whole country. But let me just talk about some of those basic things that I think need to exist. You need to have a lot of people, and that's what's so gratifying to me, that there's so many of you who care enough about your country that you're going to save the election right where you are. And I wish I could clone all of you to thousands of counties across the country. But step one is becoming a presence in the election office. That's my number one first step, is that you have to be a presence. And I don't remember if it was Christine who said this or if it was Shelley who said this from Loudoun County, but that the first election board meeting that the volunteers attended last year, that you always got these left-wing groups, particularly the League of Women Voters. I like to call them the plague of women voters. Some of my friends call it the League of Women Vipers. So you pick the name because they've earned it. But that they turned and said, "What are you doing here?" They have believed that the election offices have been their sole purview for all these years. And the fact that we are now showing up and being there and asking questions and paying attention, they are saying, "What are you doing here?" And I think it was Loudoun County where, after a number of FOIA requests from the Republican Citizens Task Force, that the Democrats started FOIAing the FOIA requests that the Republican task force had been submitting. They wanted to know what it was we were finding out. I love that. So the first thing is becoming a presence, attending the meetings, researching your election office. Who are these people that these registrars? I think you guys have done pretty good investigation of where did this registrar come from? And he was new to Virginia, and what's his background? I think it's important to know who does business with the election offices. Do they have contracts with some of these left-wing organizations? Center for Civic Design is one of those that it designs ballots. I don't know exactly under Virginia law whether the local registrars contract for the ballot designs or whether that's done at the state level, but it's important to know that because there's a left-wing organization that was created over the last decade, and they have contracts with with election offices all over the country. The Center for Civic Design. Remember during the California recall, where people discovered that if you put your recall ballot in frontwards, that how you voted appeared through the window. It was you could see it through the window of the return envelope. Center for Civic Design designed those ballots in those envelopes. Excuse me, pardon me. But it's important to know who's doing business with your local election office. And so doing research about that, who has contracts, that's important to just know everything you can know about who's on the board. And as Christine says, we have a good Republican member of the board in Fairfax County. For some reason, I've never understood this, but we could say this about so many different situations, whether it's Congress and the US Senate or whatever, where Republicans, when they get in, they don't fight, and the Democrats are always fighting. And I always think, what is that about? And so many Republican members of election boards think that they have to be nonpartisan, and meanwhile they're being steamrolled by the very partisan Democrats on the board. So it helps for you to be there and to be asking questions. And I was actually at a meeting the other day, because one of the things I'm doing is working with states around the country. We've identified 9 states that are target states for 2022. And we're trying to help create these election integrity task forces in those states. And one of the ways that we're doing that is we are helping them to have it. We're going to sponsor, CPI is going to sponsor a statewide election integrity summit and bring them in to do training and to try to get some of these people around the country to do what you're doing. But it was interesting because one group told me at a meeting I was in North Carolina last weekend that they had learned that they would take their Republican election board member to lunch and talk in advance about the business that was going to come before the board and just talk through various issues and make suggestions, and finally got to the point where they actually wrote out some proposed motions that their Republican member could offer, and that Republican member who'd never been very effective began to learn how to do her job. And so I don't know if that violates open meetings laws, but I don't think so, since it's just one person, and they can meet together. But I guess the point is figuring out what the problems are and what you can do to solve them. And it just takes being there. It's a lot like being a parent. You just have to be there and pay attention. But knowing your election board, researching it is really important. A third step is understanding the whole, how are these absentee ballots, mail ballots, how does that work in the county? What about the applications? Look, I mean, let's not forget, there was no announcement by the registrar in Fairfax County saying, oh, by the way, to the public, we're going to start disregarding the statute. We're just not going to include, we're not going to require the last 4 digits of the Social Security number on the applications. He didn't ever announce that. He said that, he instructed that to his workers, and some workers actually wanted to make sure that the law was followed, and they made that known to the volunteers. And that is how that violation of law came to light. It was because you guys were there, and that is how that became known. And I really believe that had you not been there, had you not confirmed that, found that out, and filed suit, I think that could have gotten well out of hand across the state. But so again, knowing every step of what is supposed to happen whenever there's a piece of mail that goes out from the county or from the registrar in the case of Virginia, and what happens when it comes back in. And that also goes to another thing that would happen. I don't know how many of you were involved in this, but remember that those boxes of undeliverable mail that some of the volunteers on your task force saw last summer, May, June, whenever it was, that when they had sent the confirmation letters for registrations and they came back undeliverable, they were just putting them in boxes. And you guys saw, some people saw the boxes and you figured out what was happening. You went to Clarabelle and others and said, is this what's supposed to happen? Clarabelle said, no, that's supposed to be entered into Veris. And then when those people show up to vote, they have to present some ID. I think it's one of the things the Democrats forgot to repeal. But you got that done. You got that changed. You got them to follow the law. Think how many situations that might have corrected, how many potentially illegal votes there might have been if you hadn't done that, if you hadn't been there, and if you hadn't learned what to do. And when you see these things, we're able to go and say, here's what the law requires. But having people who know every step of the way, what does the law say? What does the state board say? What do the procedures say? What does this county do? For purposes of the mail ballots, it's just hugely, hugely important to know what's supposed to happen. So when you see something, that isn't the way that's supposed to be. And one of the things that we noticed I'm trying to remember, it was early October. I think it might have been Christine who found, someone saw an article about Senator Warner meeting with these left-wing groups and the head of the Postal Service that is responsible for election mail in Virginia. So we said, well, we're going to get a meeting with the Postal Service people. We started in October to try to get that meeting. We did not have the meeting until January. By the time we had the meeting, it got more high-level people. It kept going up the food chain in the Postal Service. And so we had the meeting with the representatives from the Postal Service, asked them a lot of questions. One of the things we learned, in fact, Ned Jones has written a circular, and I'm working on getting that published because I think that'd be really helpful for people on the part of the task force who need to understand how the Postal Service and how the absentee ballot and the mail voting all works together. But one of the important things we learned, and we're working on, we need to file a FOIA request with the federal government. Of course, those are not as easy to deal with as the FOIA laws in Virginia. You have great FOIA laws in Virginia, don't let them change those. But when third parties like the Center for Voter Participation and Center for Voter Information, those left-wing groups that sent out those 2 million absentee ballot applications in Virginia last year, with those applications that are pre-populated with everything except the last 4 digits of the Social Security number, they fill out a form when they take the mail to be delivered. There's a form that all mailers give to mailing entities. The mail house gives to the post office. It says who's paying for it and all, but it also says what you want. What is the disposition? What do you want the disposition to be of mail that is undeliverable? And then they get it. There's a whole lot of steps, but the point is that they get a report, an electronic report that says what mail is not deliverable and why. The post office has 10 reasons, 10 categories of undeliverable mail. They get that report when they send out, and remember, they're only mailing to people on the voter list. So we asked, why wouldn't that be a public record? Because it's based on the voter list, which is a public record. But I actually have suggested, I've been working with people in Florida on the bills that are going through the Florida legislature, and I have written some language for them to consider that all mail that goes from the election office to a voter about voter registration, about confirming identity of the voter, confirming the address of the voter, sending an absentee ballot application or an absentee ballot, that any and all of that mail should be sent non-forwardable, that it should have an intelligent barcode. That's one of the terms of art we learned from our meeting with the postal authorities, that would then, if that barcode is on there, that then would trigger the Postal Service giving a report back to the Board of Supervisors, or the Supervisors of Elections, as they call it in Florida, as to the reasons it's not deliverable. It's not only undeliverable, but here is why. Is it a vacant lot? Is it a commercial address? Is it a post office box? Is the person deceased? Is the person moved? I mean, there are all these different categories. The registrars ought to be getting that information, but they're not. But in any event, getting knee deep into the absentee ballot process and the relationship with the post office is just hugely important. And you need to have people who that's what they become expert in. Becoming part of the election apparatus. Well, look, I mean, one of the things that you guys did that's hugely important, every state in the country has a requirement that election officials there needs to be parity between Democrats and Republicans. And so that is not a new statutory requirement. That's the check and balance that's in the statute. But I will tell you, for years, I don't care what state I've gone into, I'll look and see that you have Democrats filling Republican slots. And so one of the things that I think you guys did really well was that you recruited people who said, yes, you'd be willing to be an election worker. You took that to the registrar. It's harder when you're not registered by party, but doing the research to find out that these 10 people who are filling Republican slots all gave money to the Democratic candidates. I mean, that's not hard to figure, but just going back and going back and going back and saying, no, this isn't right, this isn't right, this isn't right, and getting to closer to parity than ever before in history. And I'll give you an example. I was talking to people in Detroit, and they've got a wonderful young election integrity director that's being paid by the RNC, and he's just wonderful. He's working so beautifully with the grassroots groups there. I mean, it's really great. But he did an analysis from the 2020 election, looking at the total number of slots there were for election judges and officials. They call them different things, but the total number in the greater Detroit area of possible election official slots. There were over 5,000. Would you like to know how many Republicans there were in those 5,000? When the law says they're supposed to be equal, 174 Republicans out of over 5,000 slots. So they are doing a massive push to get people to come forward to be certified. There's a whole big process in Michigan, but they can fill those slots from other places in the state. And so that's what they're working on, to recruit and begin to make a dent in who's counting the ballots and who's running the election in Detroit. And that's what the left, let me come back to, this is what the left hates. They call that putting big live vote counters in place. They call us vote suppressors, just because we're working hard to try to make sure that we have parity as the law requires. So being part of the election apparatus, being a worker, being an observer. And I want to say this, one of the reasons that this extended early voting is so terrible is because it is hard to have transparency when it is extended over 47 days. I mean, that is hard to do. And that is one of the things the left wants to not have, is transparency. They want to have as much voting as possible that takes place outside the purview of observers. That's why they've moved so much of the voting to voting by mail, voting absentee. It's no accident that the president of the National Vote at Home Institute from Wisconsin, who was heavily involved in operating the whole Zuckerbucks chicanery in Wisconsin, that person, Joe Biden, has appointed to the U.S. Postal Commission last year. So they want to move as much voting as possible on the observation requirements that have historically been in existence. Rolls, cleaning voter rolls, list maintenance. You know, we could do a whole section on that. Christian Adams, I work with all the time. Now, Christian is always, because he's knee deep in the law and what the left has done. And, you know, he spends all his time, Public Interest Legal Foundation spends a lot of its time and effort suing jurisdictions to remove dead people from the rolls and other list maintenance requirements. They've just sued 4 states to obtain their list maintenance records, which are required by federal law to be public. You ought to be able to go into the election office in Fairfax County, and you ought to be, and you are under federal law authorized to ask for the list maintenance procedures and records to show what they have done to clean the voter rolls in Fairfax County. And ERIC, which is this consortium that was originally put together by the Pew Charitable Trust, in which a lot of state, you know, I think most of the states belong to now, pay to be part of, and they are having states enter into agreements that say that they cannot provide, that they're not allowed by contract with ERIC to provide list maintenance records that are required by federal law to be public. So there's a big push by the left, and it was included in HR 1 and S1 to make voter rolls non-public record, and to put it behind a firewall to say that, in Virginia, it's not easy. You have to be, if you're just a third party and you want a copy of the voter rolls, you have to pay, what is it, $19,000. If you're a PAC or party, you can get it either free or whatever. But this is a battle we're having that we need to have, which is to make sure that voter rolls are public information and that they not be put behind closed doors and beyond our reach and our ability to inspect. And I've been talking with some people who have, and I'm not a techie. I will always tell you, I'm not a technology person. So you need to have someone who is. That's not me. But are there technology solutions to be able to quickly analyze voter rolls and run them against other available data to be able to tell what the anomalies are and to be able to tell what where the problems are? I know this one organization has done an analysis of the Wisconsin voter rolls, which is pretty shocking. It's pretty shocking. There are like 19,000 people have the same identifying number, their voter identifying number assigned by the election officials, and they all have the same identifying number. How's that possible? Lots and lots of problems with the voter rolls. And I was talking with someone today about the fact that North Carolina has fairly good procedures. The problem is that it's so antiquated on such, old technology that it's impossible. It has to be then translated in order for people to even be able to review the data because it's generations old. Now, I know I haven't said that in a way that those of you who are technologically smart would think I butchered that, which I think you know what I mean. So, but voter rolls are a huge problem in our country, and the left has done everything they can do to make them as polluted as possible. I noticed one thing, and I was looking at this, ERIC, their bylaws the other day. They actually have a provision in their bylaws that member states are not allowed to look at citizenship data. Now, think about that for a moment, that they're telling their members, you cannot examine to see whether the voters in your database are citizens or non-citizens. So it's pretty startling. I'm getting ready to write something about all that. But voter rolls, list maintenance, these are things we need to be focused on. I think we need to see if there are technological solutions that can help disclose and keep it all public. So it's not just going to the election offices, but where reports can be made public so people can see the problems. I'm a big believer that accountability is only possible through transparency. Vulnerable voters. One of the things that I talk about in my booklet, I told you I got my start with being on the absentee ballot board, which is really nursing home voting. But there's an organization that I worked with in 2020 to help them develop a plan and help them get funding for what they call their Protect Elderly Votes plan. And it's the American Constitutional Rights Union, and they developed quite a robust system for form letters that are in accordance with every state's laws. So you get that packet from them. I think people should go and meet with administrators of nursing homes and group homes and facilities in the county and make them know that they are legally obligated to protect the voting rights of their patients, their residents. Because I always say that the left preys upon the vulnerable voters, whether it's the homeless, the group home for the mentally retarded, or elderly, assisted living, all these different categories. They prey upon them. They don't pray for them. They don't pray with them, but they prey upon them because what they see are groups of voters that they can manipulate. And it's a very big problem. And I hope that you'll have a group of people who really become familiar with what the law is. And this one organization, the ACRU, has this project, and they'll help you. They're willing to help you. They came to our training, our summit. They did training at the summit in August in Richmond, and they'll help you. They are there to help. They want to help. And then the last area is the area that, again, I am not an expert on, but it is the eyes on the voting systems and software, knowing what the systems are, how they're supposed to work. And look, I mean, the Election Systems Commission just issued new voluntary voting system guidelines last fall for the first time in, I want to say, 20 years. And for me to read them is really difficult because I don't really understand a lot of it, but I know that there are those of you who know how to do that and read that. Northern Virginia, you got lots of technologically astute people, but I do think it's important in voting, as with anything, but particularly in election machines and all. It is not appropriate for the only people in the room to understand how the voting systems work to be the vendors, because think about who's on your election boards. And what happens, I think, is what happens with a lot of things. If the people who are talking tech to someone who's making the purchasing decision who doesn't understand the technology and the terminology, that's not a good situation. It's a way that by having people who do understand what is the voting system, what are those systems that are used, what are the ways that you can learn about, be familiar with, be a watchdog, and then how they operate during the election. I know that in Loudoun County, during early voting, one of the things that they did was whoever had the shift, the poll watcher who had the shift when the polls closed at the end of the day, is that they went and they got the numbers off the voting machine and recorded it and made sure that it matched the number of people who had signed in to Veris for that day. Because if they didn't do it every day, the next morning, the machine was reset. So they started doing that, but there are just so many things that you will figure out and know and learn if you can just have people involved in this who know the lingo and can understand the terminology. So look, I mean, I will tell you that the most important thing we can do is what you're doing. I think let me think if I can tell you a few things about, the legislatures are done, they're doing work, they're trying to do more work. I try to put in my podcast, interview people who are talking about different aspects of the election process. Last week, I had Seth Grove, who's state lawmaker from Pennsylvania, who told about how he was thrust into this position as chairman of the state government committee in December of 2020. And the first thing he did was he ended up having this series of hearings on the conduct of the election in Pennsylvania in 2020. And they issued a report, and they put together a comprehensive, complete redoing of a modernization of the Pennsylvania election code. And they had the support of the election officials around the state because it provided for more funding for them. But one of the things that they did was they created a whole section on post-election audits. And honestly, I never really thought about that until I listened to him describe this at a meeting we were at a year ago. And what he was talking about was that they assigned the state auditor to conduct post-election audits in the same way that any other audit would be conducted. And they put together standards, compliance audit, making sure that everything reconciled and that it's conducted by someone not in the election office. I mean, there's a thought. Why does the election office always audit itself? Why are they the ones that are looking after to see whether or not they conducted the election properly? It makes no sense. But there's so much that there's so many people who have come up with so many ideas about our election process, about modernizing and upgrading. But the main thing is watching what's going on. And now what's interesting to me is that those of you who've been involved in the election process in 2021 have become an important grassroots force to get the legislature in Virginia to change some of the things, the bad stuff that had happened in years before. But there's so much going on. There's so much we have to do. We're going to run into so many attacks and insults. I will tell you, my biggest fear is that the Biden administration is in the process of trying to figure out how to turn every federal agency into a Democrat voter turnout machine like they did with Zuckerbucks and the election offices in 2020. I'll have more on that as I pull together more information, but trying to figure out how to fight them on that is not easy. But the only way we fight them is doing what you're doing. We'll never have as much money as they do, but we have people and we have patriots who care about our country and care about reclaiming our election system. So I thank you so much for all you're doing. Virginia is the model, and Virginia's the model because you guys are the model. So I go brag about you guys everywhere.